Whether they were clever concepts too far ahead of their time, or good stories led by relative nobodies, these 90s movies didn't hit as big as they should have. It turns out even some of the greatest movies of all time come out of the gate as duds. A debonair billionaire who spends his evenings fighting the forces of evil is often a recipe for a blockbuster. For example, when that billionaire is named Bruce Wayne and his alter ego is Batman, people usually come flocking. When it's Lamont Cranston parading around as the Shadow, however, it's a different story. Despite being a big inspiration for Batman, the Shadow has never come close to reaching the same heights as the Dark Knight. Debuting in 1930, nearly a decade before Bob Kane with Bill Finger debuted Batman, the Shadow was a mainstay on radio and B-movie serials throughout the 30s and 40s. But it would be 64 years before he got the big-budget tentpole treatment with 1994's The Shadow. Starring Alec Baldwin as the eponymous Avenger, The Shadow cost $40 million, but only swooped up $31 million domestically, less than Tim Burton's Batman made in one weekend in 1989. Despite its poor performance in theaters, The Shadow is certainly not a bad film and deserved more than its mediocre reviews. Anchored well by Baldwin and bolstered by an all-star supporting cast, including John Lone, Ian McKellen, and Peter Boyle, it's a fun, pulpy popcorn flick. It's also scored with grim grandeur by Jerry Goldsmith. To this day, the reason The Shadow fared so poorly at the box office remains as mysterious as the titular figure himself. In his prime, Dutch filmmaker Paul Verhoeven was such an effective satirist of American culture and cinema that American filmgoers and critics had trouble knowing when he was joking. This happened most famously upon the release of his 1997 sci-fi epic Starship Troopers, a broad, over-the-top send-up of pro-war propaganda that went over the heads of an audience to whom patriotic violence was so common that it became a vision worth embracing. A similar problem arose with Verhoeven's previous film, Showgirls, a ridiculous, exploitative NC-17 rated drama about a young woman trying to make it as an exotic dancer in Las Vegas. Broadly panned upon its release for its intense acting and gratuitous sex scenes, Showgirls only grossed about $20 million domestically on a $45 million budget.
It's worse than dog food.
In the years since, however, Showgirls has become an iconic film of the 1990s. Some fans see it as a riotous parody and have mined it for inspiration in drag shows, stage reenactments, and other gleefully garish rituals. Still, others feel that there's nothing funny about Showgirls at all, and that its superficial hyperbole is the only way to truly capture the cruel, misogynist meat grinder of the entertainment industry. Either way, Showgirls has been rescued from the dustbin of infamy and frequently appears on cable, streaming services, and art house theaters, typically around midnight. Making a sequel to an iconic movie isn't usually a good idea. However, if Jack Nicholson's involved, that tune might change. Even if The Two Jakes, his 1990 sequel to 1974's Chinatown, doesn't come close to its predecessor, it's still pretty solid. Nicholson is back as private investigator J.J. Jake Gittes, who is hired by the other titular Jake for routine work. Unfortunately for Jake number 1, Jake number 2 decides to kill his business partner, who is also his wife's lover, which sucks Gittes into a web of conspiracy. The plot is a lot, especially when the movie contrives a connection to Chinatown. You'll be forgiven for being a little confused at some points, but we don't watch retro detective stories for coherence, we watch them for their coolness factor, and this film does not disappoint. Sadly, after The Two Jakes tanked with only $10 million in box office receipts, the film was practically forgotten about, though many critics feel this is a shame. As the Los Angeles Times wrote, The Two Jakes may not be a masterpiece, and it certainly never approaches the Greek tragic grandeur of Chinatown. But it's also a richer, more resonant movie than its non-existent reputation suggests. Disney is no stranger to live-action box office bombs, but before the likes of The Lone Ranger and John Carter, one of the Mouse House's biggest turkeys was 1992's Newsies. While Disney was essentially printing money with animated musicals in the 1990s, this Christian Bale-led live-action depiction of the 1899 Newsboys strike banked an abysmal $2.7 million. Of course, live-action movie musicals have been hit or miss at the box office for decades, which is why 2023's Wonka wasn't even marketed as one. So if the elevator pitch for Newsies doesn't sound particularly appealing to you, it didn't excite moviegoers in 1992 either. The thing is, it's the music that makes a musical, and longtime Disney maestro Alan Menken managed to craft some infectious melodies out of labor relations. Newsies boasts a peppy and upbeat soundtrack, featuring such memorable tunes as Seize the Day and the world will know. Actor and writer Harvey Fierstein knew that Disney had something, so he retooled Newsies as a successful stage production that became a hit after moving to Broadway in 2012. We wouldn't be surprised if the musical based on the movie becomes a movie again, and would be even less surprised if marketing took the Wonka route and didn't even advertise it as a musical. In the meantime, why not give this flawed but undeniably charming flick a try? Robert Downey Jr.'s Oscar win for Oppenheimer was a long time coming, capping off what is perhaps the greatest comeback story in Hollywood history. While nobody could have predicted that he would become a blockbuster movie star as Tony Stark in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he had long been respected as one of the greatest screen actors of a generation. One key reason for this accolade was his Oscar-nominated performance in 1992's Chaplin. Directed by the late Richard Attenborough, the biopic tells the tale of Charlie Chaplin, who recounts his life from poverty to silent film star to global icon. Downey Jr. leads an all-star supporting cast that includes Dan Aykroyd, Anthony Hopkins, Mila Jovovich, Kevin Kline, Diane Lane, Marissa Tomei, and James Woods. Yet, despite the stellar talent in front of and behind the camera, Chaplin failed to find an audience, banking only $9.2 million at the box office.
I mean, couldn't you just enjoy it?
I can now, but I couldn't then. It meant too much.
Performances like these earned Downey Jr. the dreaded box office poison label, which stuck with him for most of his pre-Iron Man career. When it comes to Chaplin, this criticism is wholly unfair, as Downey Jr. elevates what might have otherwise been a formulaic biopic to one we can't stay silent about. If you're a fan of Robert Downey Jr. or Charlie Chaplin, it's definitely a must-watch movie. 1 year before appearing as the smarmy villain in Titanic, Billy Zane tried to slam evil in a skin-tight mauve suit in one of the biggest busts of the 90s, 1996's The Phantom. Based on Lee Falk's pulp comic from the 1930s, Zane plays Kit Walker, the titular Phantom. He is the latest in a familial line of purple-clad superheroes who have sworn to fight evil from their fictional African island hideout since the 16th century. Now, Kit must work with his ex-girlfriend to stop the dastardly Xander Drax from wielding the power of 3 magic skulls. The Phantom delivers exactly what it promises, and thanks to Zane's earnestness, the villain's mustache-twirling zaniness, and especially David Newman's rousing score, it feels akin to a low-rent version of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Alas, the Phantom could only ever dream of making the money Raiders did, as its $17 million haul on a $45 million budget crashed this potential franchise right out of the runway. Despite the numbers saying otherwise, the film really isn't as bad as you might expect. In fact, it's actually a pretty entertaining movie, with a review from Variety featuring the praise. While it hardly stands to vanquish the celluloid incarnations of Superman and Batman, this version of an older cartoon Crusaders exploits does have a pleasingly astute sense of its place in the great scheme of things pulp. Some might think the concept of Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin fighting a psycho bear would be enough to sell a movie, and maybe it would have been if that were the title. Instead, the filmmakers went with The Edge, which is a decision they probably still regret. Written by acclaimed playwright David Mamet, 1997's The Edge stars Hopkins as a wealthy businessman whose plane crashes in the Alaskan wilderness. He is forced to survive with a photographer, played by Baldwin, who also happens to be sleeping with his wife. And if that's not bad enough, they're both being stalked by the aforementioned psychotic Kodiak bear. The Edge is anything but a relaxing and rejuvenating tour through the beautiful Alaskan landscape. Instead, it gives you a front-row seat to surviving one of the most harrowing wildernesses in the world. While Hopkins still had plenty of clout following the success of Silence of the Lambs, it wasn't enough to take The Edge to the heights producers may have hoped.
But it never comes in the form or at the point we would prefer, does it?
The film only received lukewarm reviews, and when the dust settled, it did not make back its budget at the domestic box office. It's hard to say why The Edge never found an audience, as it packs plenty of brain and brawn, and the A-list talent certainly elevates the B-list premise. In our opinion, it's about time this overlooked film came out of hibernation. The Halloween classic Hocus Pocus has a passionate coven of converts who adore its mix of Disney vibes and black magic. However, there's no denying that it crashed worse than a tipsy witch on a broomstick when it dropped in 1993. Veteran film critic Roger Ebert may have summed up the viewing experience most aptly when he wrote, "Watching the movie is like attending a party you weren't invited to, and where you don't know anybody and they're all in on a joke but won't explain it to you." The film brought in around $40 million during its original run, on a budget of $28 million. When you factor in all the other costs of making and promoting a movie, Hocus Pocus was a big flop for the Mouse House. So how could Disney miss with such a surefire Halloween hit? Well, the simple answer is that they didn't release it during the Halloween season. Instead, execs inexplicably thought it was a bright idea to unveil Hocus Pocus in July, while Jurassic Park was still stomping to a record-breaking run in the theaters. As a result, Hocus Pocus flew well under the radar. Thankfully, the film built up the following it deserved over time, and even earned a sequel in 2022. To this day, Hocus Pocus remains a delightful romp with its three leads. Bette Midler, Sarah Jessica Parker, and Kathy Najimy played the Sanderson sisters with such gleeful gusto you almost find yourself rooting for them over the kids. With a total haul of $4.5 billion worldwide, Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean is one of the most successful franchises of all time. However, the first film probably felt like a gamble at the time, considering how spectacularly the 1995 pirate pick Cutthroat Island failed a few years before. This infamous movie remains one of the biggest bombs in Hollywood history. On a mega budget of $92 million, Cutthroat Island walked the plank with just $18 million worldwide. It put a big dent in Geena Davis's already faltering career as a leading woman, and director Rennie Harlin's reputation also took a big hit. Cutthroat Island became synonymous with box office bombs in the years that followed, and it's taken some people years to accept the fact that, all things considered, it's really not that bad. Forbes argued that the film deserves to be rediscovered after re-evaluating it on the 25th anniversary of its release. The publication even called it, quote, a huge, scaled, impressively practical, and unpretentious bit of over-the-top Hollywood junk food. Davis soars as a swashbuckler who enlists the aid of a conman as she races against her evil buccaneer uncle to recover treasure buried on the titular landmass. If you're looking to sail the seven seas without drowning in CGI, you may want to chart a course for Cutthroat Island. One of the great injustices in cinematic history is that not nearly enough people went to see Joel and Ethan Coen's 1998 masterpiece, The Big Lebowski, when it opened in theaters. Perhaps moviegoers at the time just didn't know what to make of a psychedelic pseudo-spoof of film noir with Jeff Bridges' slacker stoner in place of the sleuth. With almost $19 million domestic on a $15 million budget, The Big Lebowski was a bomb in North America, though its $47 million worldwide managed to save it from the gutter. Besides being one of the most quotable movies of all time, The Big Lebowski is a showcase for some of the most memorable performances from the likes of Philip Seymour Hoffman, Julianne Moore, Sam Elliott, Steve Buscemi, John Turturro, John Goodman, and of course, Jeff Bridges. What makes the film so special is that you can tell every single one of them is having a blast with the Coens' signature dialogue. The Los Angeles set film is an absurd existential hybrid that almost defies categorization, besides being funny in a non-traditional way. Over the decades since its release, The Big Lebowski has gone from a box office flop to a bona fide cult classic. But even with its late-in-life acclaim, some folks still might not see the appeal.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
If you spend a lot of time on the internet, you've probably seen more than one think piece about how this or that generation just doesn't want to work. Writer-director Mike Judge was well aware of this trend way back in 1999 and decided to capitalize on the unwelcoming nature of most workplaces by making Office Space.
Did you see the memo about this?
It was a message way ahead of its time, as evidenced by the box office receipts. Judge's first foray into live-action filmmaking made just $12 million worldwide on a $10 million budget. Even so, the many comedy fans who missed Office Space in multiplexes fell in love with Judge's brilliantly dry send-up of America's corporate culture on cable and home video. Office Space has become a cult classic in the years since it dropped to underwhelming figures, and fans often claim that it has inspired other creators. Some say that there are clear parallels between Office Space and both the British and American versions of The Office, while others have pointed out that the film seemingly shaped the idea for Severance. Office Space feels very 90s in the best way possible. The film shone a light on America's increasingly toxic relationship with work in a brutally hilarious fashion, and is directly responsible for many memes lampooning work culture in the modern day. 1 year after Quentin Tarantino arrived on the scene with Reservoir Dogs, and 1 year before he established himself as one of America's brightest filmmakers with Pulp Fiction, there was True Romance. The 1993 film isn't usually brought up when discussing Tarantino's body of work because it's one of the few films he wrote but didn't direct. Instead, those duties fell to a very different kind of filmmaker, the late Top Gun director Tony Scott. Unsurprisingly, this distinction creates a pretty large juxtaposition between True Romance and other Tarantino films. Christian Slater plays an Elvis-worshipping, grindhouse movie-loving loner called Clarence, who falls in love with a sex worker named Alabama. The lovebirds end up going on the run from the mob after Clarence kills Alabama's pimp and accidentally steals a suitcase of cocaine. In many ways, this plot is the epitome of a Tarantino movie, which makes the fact it wasn't directed by him all the more wild. Sadly, the film failed to make a profit, only just managing to claw back its $12.5 million production budget. Moviegoers eventually fell in love with True Romance, however, making it a cult classic. Funny enough, one of the movie's biggest fans was Tarantino. Tarantino has also written the original script for Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, and famously refused to watch the final product because he hated what was done to it. But he loved Scott's interpretation of True Romance, and so do we. Before the decade was through, the cast of the 90s film School Ties would find box office glory. Brendan Fraser, Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and Chris O'Donnell all feature in the 1992 drama, but they were a long way away from the limelight at the time. Unfortunately for the up-and-comers, School Ties failed Movie Economics 101 with a $14.7 million take from a reported budget of $18 million. That's not exactly a passing grade, but thankfully the results weren't bad enough to sink these would-be movie stars' careers before they got started. Set in the 1950s, Fraser plays a Jewish student with a football scholarship at a prestigious prep school who feels he has to hide his background from his classmates. It's a bit heavy-handed at times, and comparisons to the generally superior Dead Poets Society didn't help. But School Ties is elevated by its cast of future A-listers. Fraser is especially watchable, embodying the movie star charisma he'd bring to The Mummy just before the turn of the millennium. School Ties isn't an amazing movie, but it's a good one, and is especially entertaining as a time capsule of industry giants before they hit it big. Revisiting the film in 2012, Time Out sang its praises, writing, "The script effectively dramatizes the school's competitive, hothouse atmosphere and is sensitive to the situations of all the pupils, as well as to the pressure of expectation and tradition." One of the biggest low-budget success stories of all time, Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead made $29 million in 1983, a whopping return on investment for a movie that cost just $375,000 to make. By 1987's Evil Dead 2, the budget had ballooned to $3.5 million, which the film's $5.9 million worldwide gross sadly didn't justify. Still, both Evil Dead pictures went down in history thanks to home video, so the filmmakers figured there was enough fan demand for an epic conclusion to the saga. Released in 1993, Army of Darkness takes Bruce Campbell's Ash to the Middle Ages. The dark fantasy comedy made $11.5 million domestically, just $500,000 more than it cost to film. Thankfully, it wound up making approximately the same amount again overseas, but it still went down as a box office flop. It was enough to kill the franchise for 20 years until 2013's Evil Dead remake, which was shortly followed by Ash vs. Evil Dead's premiere on Starz in 2015. Despite the lull it may have caused, ask any cult movie fan and they will tell you that Army of Darkness finds Raimi and Campbell at the peak of their powers. Their sense of humor might not be for everyone, but those who get Army of Darkness absolutely adore it. As one Rotten Tomatoes user even gushed, "This is the best fantasy movie ever. If you have never watched it, you don't know what you're missing."
Say hello to the 21st century.
Samuel L. Jackson surprised the audience on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon when he said that his favorite role from his filmography is Mitch Hennessy from 1996's The Long Kiss Goodnight. And while those who are familiar with the character would probably agree the performance is on par with Jackson's more iconic parts, it's not surprising that much of his audience may not have heard of it. On a $65 million budget, The Long Kiss Goodnight barely made $33 million. It was a colossal dud that lead Gina Davis and director Rennie Harlin most definitely did not need just 1 year after Cutthroat Island. It's a little sad that moviegoers didn't vibe with The Long Kiss Goodnight, because it really is a criminally underseen action movie. Davis plays a highly trained, amnesia-stricken government assassin who is roused from her cozy suburban life as a schoolteacher and single mother after an accident. She hires Jackson's private detective to discover her past, only for former adversaries to come after her and her daughter. The bickering co-leads are great. Harlan's direction is tight, and Shane Black's script is whip-smart. It's a shame nobody saw The Long Kiss Goodnight at the time, but you should definitely check it out now for some incredible line delivery on Jackson's part, if nothing else.
Were you always this stupid, or did you take lessons?
I took lessons.
The first two rules of Fight Club are that you don't talk about it. In hindsight, that might explain why Fight Club failed to find a theatrical audience in 1999, despite starring Edward Norton fresh off American History X and Brad Pitt fresh off being Brad Pitt. The now iconic thriller only pulled in $37 million domestically, though a further $63 million overseas helped it reach $100 million worldwide. While that may seem like a decent performance, the problem is its $65 million price tag meant that if Fight Club made anything less than $130 million, it'd be a technical knockout. So why did Fight Club bomb at the box office? The simple explanation is that the filmmakers just spent too much money on the movie, so Fight Club had to punch above its weight to earn back its budget. That's a real shame because director David Fincher gives author Chuck Palahniuk's words weight in this adaptation of his novel, giving the story a visceral style that hits harder than a bloody fist and a twist ending that kicks harder than a roundhouse. Meanwhile, Norton creates an everyman protagonist for our times who still resonates more than a quarter of a century later, while Pitt gives arguably the standout performance of his career. You may not be able to talk about Fight Club, but you won't stop thinking about it after the credits have rolled. Michael Keaton owes a lot to Tim Burton's record-breaking Batman movies, but it's worth remembering that he got his start in comedies like 1982's Night Shift and 1983's Mr. Mom. Keaton returned to his roots in 1996's Multiplicity, directed by Harold Ramis. He plays a construction worker who is torn between family time and his demanding job, so he decides to clone himself. Things work out so well with his clone that Keaton's character clones another version of himself, then another. Before long, he's struggling to manage his multiple clones without his wife finding out. Yes, it's a contrived sitcom setup that fails to capitalize on the potential of the premise, which is especially frustrating considering it comes from the same person who directed Groundhog Day. But while Groundhog Day trades existential philosophizing for heartwarming humor, Multiplicity seems satisfied with just being silly. So that leaves viewers the choice to bemoan what Multiplicity isn't or to celebrate what it is, a fun flick that gives Keaton the chance to shine playing multiple versions of the same character. Despite being a ready-made crowd pleaser, the crowds didn't show up, as Multiplicity made an underwhelming $20 million from a budget of $45 million. The film split critics at the time, but many have come to enjoy it in the years since. As Empire magazine wrote after revisiting the movie, both assuredly funny without being forced, and smart without being smug. This is one comedy that deserves to go forth and indeed multiply. South Park creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been gleefully corrupting viewers' minds for more than a quarter of a century. But while South Park has long been the cornerstone of Comedy Central and a leading satirical voice in our culture, another one of the duo's notable 90s ventures wasn't nearly as successful. Parker and Stone starred in 1998's BASEketball as two slackers who invent a sport that combines baseball and basketball. Neil sports promoter sees them play, he takes a pseudo-sport that started in their driveway and transforms it into America's new favorite pastime. However, when a corrupt promoter tries to change the rules to maximize profits, their loyalty to the game and each other is tested. BASEketball only starred Parker and Stone, as it was the creative vision of co-writer and director David Zucker, one of the masterminds behind the madcap masterpieces Airplane and The Naked Gun. BASEketball manages to meld Zucker's zaniness with Parker and Stone's irreverence, making for an absolutely hilarious flick that will have you doubled over laughing. As to why the film didn't do great at the box office, it may have something to do with Parker and Stone lacking star power at the time.
Dude, does it just suck being you?
Either way, something led the film to strike out with a foul $7 million against a reported $25 million budget. But for fans of sophomoric satire, BASEketball will always be a home run.